February 25, 1942, San Francisco, California. The morning fog is thick, rolling under the Golden Gate Bridge like a suffocating blanket. It is cold, damp, and quiet. Too quiet. A 19-year-old National Guard sentry stands on the cliffs of the Presidio, shivering in his wool coat, staring out into the gray abyss of the Pacific. He is thinking about breakfast. He is thinking about a girl back in Sacramento. He is not thinking about war. To him, the war is thousands of miles away in the humid jungles of the Philippines or the frozen steppes of Russia. But then, the wind shifts. The fog tears open for just a second, and he sees it. Not a fishing boat, not a cargo ship. He sees the gray, angular silhouette of a battleship, then another, then the carriers, and finally, the swarm of landing craft cutting through the water like sharks. The red sun of Imperial Japan is not on a map anymore. It is in the bay. Most history books will tell you the Japanese Navy reached its limit at Pearl Harbor. They will tell you that Admiral Yamamoto feared the sleeping giant and never dared to step foot on the American mainland. We are taught that the United States was safe behind its two oceans, untouchable, an industrial god protected by distance. But that is the comfortable version of history. That is the version that lets you sleep at night. What if the gamble was bigger? What if the Japanese High Command, intoxicated by their victories in the Pacific, decided that the only way to win was not just to sting the giant, but to slit its throat in its own home? This is the story of the day the Pacific War came to Main Street. This is the story of the Battle of San Francisco. But what history books fail to mention, and what the government tried to bury for 50 years, is the one decision that changed everything. The decision was not to evacuate. It was not to surrender the city to save lives. The secret order given by the War Department to the local commanders was chilling in its simplicity. If the city falls, burn it to the ground. Nothing for the enemy. This is the untold story of American desperation and the ruthless industrial violence that was unleashed to take it back. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you're holding your phone right now or watching this on your screen, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, do it now. Subscribe to World War II Dark Secrets. The first sound was not an explosion. It was the siren. The air raid sirens in San Francisco had been tested before, wailing mournfully on Saturday afternoons, ignored by shoppers and businessmen rushing to lunch. But this time, the wail was accompanied by the low, guttural roar of aircraft engines. Not the high-pitched whine of American trainers, but the aggressive, hornet-like buzz of the Mitsubishi Zero. At 07:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese fighters screamed over the Twin Peaks. They didn't drop bombs initially. They strafed. They were clearing the path. Bullets chewed through the asphalt of Market Street, shattering storefronts, sending glass spraying over pedestrians who froze, unable to comprehend that the monsters from the newsreels were here, right now, killing them. On the Golden Gate Bridge, traffic stopped. Commuters stepped out of their sedans, looking up. The Japanese pilots, elite veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, saw the ultimate prize. The bridge was the symbol of American engineering dominance, a testament to the rich, untouchable republic. Two Zeros dipped their wings and unleashed a torrent of 20mm cannon fire. The suspension cables sparked. Cars exploded into fireballs. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The United States was the richest nation on earth, a country of steel, oil, and automobiles. We were the rich warriors, accustomed to fighting our wars over there. We sent our boys away with chocolate and cigarettes. We didn't fight in our own driveways. But the Japanese weren't just here to scare civilians. They were here to seize the ultimate strategic asset, the West Coast harbors. Below the panic on the bridge, the invasion force was hitting the sand. At Baker Beach and Ocean Beach, the first Japanese Marines stormed ashore. These were not conscripts. These were the Special Naval Landing Forces, hardened killers who had sacked cities across Asia. They hit the cold California sand expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found confusion. The local coastal defense consisted of a few sandbagged machine gun nests manned by terrified National Guard units with World War I surplus rifles and almost no ammunition. The initial firefight at the Presidio was a slaughter. The American boys, sons of farmers and shopkeepers, fought with a desperate, clumsy bravery. They fired their bolt-action Springfields until the magazines were empty, but they were facing a modern, coordinated assault force supported by naval gunfire. A Japanese destroyer moved dangerously close to the shore, its guns pounding the cliffs. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic thumping that cracked the windows of the extravagant mansions in Seacliff. The rich warrior was waking up, but he was waking up with a concussion. The wealth of America, the beautiful homes, the paved roads, the telephone lines suddenly meant nothing against the raw, primitive reality of bayonets and mortars. By 09 a.m., the Japanese had established a firm beachhead. They began to push inland, moving through the manicured parks and residential streets. This is where the reality of the invasion became truly surreal. Enemy soldiers were moving past mailboxes, past parked Fords and Chevrolets, past picket fences. They were invading the American dream. The San Francisco Police Department, armed only with revolvers and shotguns, tried to set up roadblocks on 19th Avenue. It was suicide. The Japanese advanced with Type 95 light tanks, tin cans compared to what Detroit would later produce, but monsters against police cruisers. The tanks rolled over the barricades, crushing the police cars like toys. Panic seized the city. It wasn't just fear, it was a total societal collapse. The highways leading south out of the city were instantly gridlocked. Packard sedans, delivery trucks, and luxury convertibles were jammed bumper to bumper. People abandoned their cars loaded with silverware, heirlooms, and cash, fleeing on foot. This was the vulnerability of the rich society. We had so much to lose. The Japanese soldier fought for the emperor and a bowl of rice. The American civilian was fighting for a lifestyle, for a standard of living that was the envy of the world. And watching that lifestyle burn created a unique kind of terror. In Washington, D.C., the news hit the White House like a physical blow. President Roosevelt was wheeled into the Situation Room, his face ashen. The reports were fragmentary, screaming over telegraph wires that were being cut one by one. Enemy forces on California soil, San Francisco under attack, casualties heavy. General Marshall, the architect of the U.S. Army, looked at the map. He knew the truth. The West Coast was undefended. The Pacific Fleet was shattered at Pearl Harbor. The bulk of the trained army was training in the East or deploying to Europe. There was nothing between the Japanese Imperial Army and the American heartland except civilians and scattered guard units. Marshall made a call that afternoon that defined the American response. He didn't order a retreat. He ordered a mobilization of such violence and scale that it would reshape the planet. He contacted the governors of California, Nevada, and Oregon. He said, mobilize the militia, mobilize the police, mobilize the civilians. If they have a gun, they are now soldiers. We will not give them an inch of this continent. It was a call to the arsenal of democracy, but not the factories. It was a call to the people. America was unique in one specific way. It was the most heavily armed civilian population in history. Hunters, ranchers, veterans. The rich warrior had a gun cabinet in every home. Back in San Francisco, the sun was high, but the sky was black with smoke. The Japanese had taken the Presidio and were moving toward the city center, but the easy walk was over. The shock was wearing off, and the anger was setting in. At the intersection of California Street, a group of civilians had barricaded a cable car. They weren't soldiers. They were dock workers, longshoremen, tough men who worked the piers. They had hunting rifles, tire irons, and Molotov cocktails made from high-end whiskey bottles looted from a nearby hotel. When the Japanese infantry patrol marched up the hill expecting cowed civilians, they were met with a hail of .30-06 rounds. A Japanese officer fell, hit in the chest by a deer slug fired by a 60-year-old mechanic. The invaders were stunned. In China, civilians fled. In America, the civilians were shooting back with high-powered game rifles.
The street battle that followed was brutal. The Japanese brought up mortars and blasted the cable car, turning it into splintered wood and twisted steel. They killed the defenders to the last man, but the delay mattered. It bought time. Time for the shattered remnants of the National Guard to regroup at Golden Gate Park. Time for the U.S. Army Air Corps to scramble whatever planes they had left in the state. As night fell on February 25th, the city was burning. The Japanese controlled the northern waterfront and the high ground. They set up their command post in the Fairmont Hotel, tearing down the American flag and raising the rising sun over the skyline. It was a humiliating image, one that would be seared into the American consciousness forever. But in the darkness of Golden Gate Park, something else was happening. Trucks were arriving. Not military trucks, but delivery trucks, farm trucks, buses. They were bringing men from Oakland, from San Jose, from the Central Valley. They carried shotguns, lever-action Winchesters, and pitchforks. The Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, sitting on his flagship just outside the Golden Gate, looked at the fires burning in the city. He sipped his tea, feeling the vibration of the ship's engines. He had achieved the impossible. He had invaded the United States. He thought he had broken the American spirit. He thought the rich warriors would crumble when their luxury was threatened. He was wrong. He hadn't broken them. He'd just removed their leash. The United States was not a normal nation. It was a continent-spanning industrial monster, and it was about to stop being polite. The sleeping giant wasn't just awake, it was rabid, and it had infinite resources to burn.
The dawn of February 26, 1942, brought no relief to the burning city of San Francisco. The smoke from the previous day's fighting had mixed with the morning fog, creating a toxic, acrid smog that stung the eyes and coated the lungs. The Japanese forces, disciplined and ruthless, had spent the night digging in. They had turned the grand Victorian houses of Pacific Heights into fortresses. Machine guns were mounted in bay windows that had once looked out over peaceful gardens. Snipers positioned themselves on the tiled roofs of Spanish-style mansions. They were acting with the precision of a surgeon, slicing the city into controlled zones. But they were about to discover that the patient was thrashing on the table. General Joseph Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe, had arrived in Oakland just hours before dawn to take command of the defense. Stilwell was a hard man, a man who hated retreat, and he looked across the bay at the occupied city with a cold fury. He didn't have tanks. He didn't have enough artillery. What he had was the sheer, overwhelming abundance of American material wealth repurposed for violence. He commandeered the entire logistical network of the Bay Area. He seized every fuel tanker, every bulldozer, and every ton of dynamite in the region. The rich warrior strategy was coming into play. If we can't outshoot them yet, we will outspend and outbuild them on the battlefield. Stilwell's plan was horrifying. He couldn't retake the city house by house. The casualties would be astronomical. So he decided to use the city's infrastructure against the invaders. He ordered the engineers to manipulate the water pressure and gas lines. At 08 a.m., a massive explosion rocked the Marina district. American engineers had intentionally overloaded the gas mains in the sectors occupied by the Japanese. Blocks of high-end real estate erupted into flames. It was a scorched earth tactic applied to American soil. The Japanese troops, confused by an enemy willing to destroy its own wealth to kill them, were forced into the open streets. That's when the Mosquito Fleet arrived. This wasn't the U.S. Navy. The Navy was still licking its wounds. This was a spontaneous armada of private American vessels. Fishing trawlers from Monterey, luxury yachts from Sausalito, tugboats and speedboats. They swarmed the bay, hundreds of them. They weren't armed with naval guns, but they were packed with National Guardsmen, Marines, and armed civilians. A 50-foot yacht owned by a movie producer roared toward the docks with a .50 caliber machine gun bolted to its teak deck. It was absurd, it was chaotic, but it was effective. The Japanese patrol boats were overwhelmed by the sheer number of targets. The battle for the docks was a meat grinder. The Japanese had set up kill zones, their Nanbu machine guns traversing back and forth, cutting down the first wave of makeshift landing craft. The water of the bay turned a dark, murky red, but for every boat they sank, 3 more took its place. This was the American way of war, attrition through abundance. We had more boats, more fuel, and more angry men than they had bullets. The landing forces pushed through the fire, climbing over the bodies of their comrades, driven by a patriotic rage that bordered on insanity. They weren't fighting for territory, they were fighting for their homes. In the skies, the disparity was shifting. The Japanese Zeros were still superior to the obsolete P-40 Warhawks the Americans were flying, but the Americans had something else: radios. Every American pilot had a high-quality radio. Every ground commander had a radio. The coordination was sloppy, but it existed. The Japanese pilots, relying on visual signals and limited comms, found themselves caught in traps. A flight of 4 Zeros chasing a lone P-40 over Alcatraz was suddenly bounced by 12 American fighters diving from the sun. The U.S. pilots didn't dogfight, they slashed. They used the heavy weight of their planes to dive, fire, and zoom climb back up. They were learning fast. By noon, the street fighting had reached the civic center. The Japanese had fortified the city hall, a massive domed structure that dominated the area. It became the Alamo of the invasion. Japanese Marines held the stairs and the rotunda, firing down at the approaching Americans. The U.S. response was to bring up the heavy machinery. Not tanks, they were still too few. They brought up bulldozers. Armored with hastily welded steel plates, these yellow monsters from the Department of Public Works rumbled down the wide boulevards. They pushed debris, crushed barricades, and provided mobile cover for the infantry. It was a construction crew going to war. The battle inside City Hall was hand-to-hand, knives, bayonets, and entrenching tools. The marble floors became slick with blood. The Japanese fought with the terrifying Bushido spirit, refusing to surrender, blowing themselves up with grenades when cornered. But the Americans fought with a gangster-like brutality. They used Tommy guns, the Chicago typewriter, sweeping rooms with .45 caliber slugs. They threw bundles of dynamite into elevator shafts. There was no chivalry here. This was a street brawl between an empire of tradition and an empire of industry. As the sun began to set on the second day, a new sound rumbled from the south. It was the sound of salvation, the railroads. The Southern Pacific Railroad had cleared the tracks, and the first heavy trains were arriving from Southern California. Flat cars loaded with the 40th Armored Division. General Patton wasn't there, but his spirit was. These were M3 Stuart tanks and early M3 Lee tanks. They were ugly, tall, and awkward, but they were tanks. They rolled off the flat cars in the rail yards and immediately clattered onto the pavement. The American armor commanders, chewing cigars and shouting over the intercoms, blasted the Japanese strongpoints with 37mm and 75mm cannons. They didn't care about collateral damage. They blew apart corner stores and tram stops to dig out the enemy. The order was clear: push them into the sea. But the Japanese had one final horrifying card to play. Admiral Yamamoto, realizing the beachhead was collapsing under the weight of the American counterattack, ordered the fleet to open fire on the city itself. The battleships offshore turned their massive guns toward the civilian districts. 14-inch shells, weighing as much as a small car, began to arc over the hills. The destruction was apocalyptic. Entire city blocks were vaporized in seconds. The Fairmont Hotel, the Japanese command post, was abandoned as they retreated toward the beaches. The shelling wasn't tactical, it was punitive. It was a message: if we can't have this city, no one can. The fires raged out of control. San Francisco was becoming a second Pompeii.
But amidst the shelling, the American resistance didn't break. It hardened. Civilians formed bucket brigades not to save houses, but to keep the roads open for the tanks. Nurses and doctors worked in the basements of bombed-out hospitals, operating by flashlight. The sheer resilience of the population was the secret weapon the Japanese had underestimated. They assumed a soft, luxury-addicted people would crumble. Instead, they found that beneath the suits and the silk ties, the Americans were wolves waiting for a reason to bite.
The night of February 26th did not bring darkness to San Francisco. The sky was a churning, glowing bruise of orange and violet, illuminated by the inferno of the burning Marina District. The fog, usually a comforting blanket for the city, had turned into a suffocating shroud of steam and smoke, trapping the heat and the smell of cordite against the hills. To the Japanese soldiers dug into the sand dunes of Baker Beach and the manicured lawns of the Presidio, it must have felt like they had invaded hell itself. They were elite troops, veterans who had marched through the gates of Nanking and the jungles of Malaya. They were used to enemies who ran, enemies who lacked ammunition, enemies who surrendered. But the Americans facing them now were different. They were possessed by a cold, industrial fury. They weren't just fighting, they were exterminating. General Stilwell, operating from a bunker in Oakland, looked at the map. The Japanese perimeter was shrinking, compressed into a narrow strip along the coast. Any other commander might have waited for morning. Any other commander might have paused to reorganize, to count the dead, to let the men rest. But Stilwell knew the American doctrine better than anyone. You do not give the enemy rest. You do not give him time to dig deeper. You crush him with weight. At 2100 hours, he gave the order for the general assault. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a sledgehammer. The spearhead of the attack was the 1st Battalion of the 40th Armored Division, led by the M3 tanks that had arrived by rail only hours earlier. But these tanks were not alone. Following closely behind them was something that terrified even the bravest soldiers, the Chemical Warfare Service troops equipped with portable M2 flamethrowers, the Zippos. The order had come down from Washington, a secret directive that would never be published in the newspapers. Burn them out. Do not sacrifice American lives to clear a bunker. Use fire. This was the grim reality of the rich warrior. We had the technology to manufacture liquid fire in industrial quantities, and we had the will to use it on our own golf courses if it meant killing the invader. The assault began with an artillery barrage that defied belief. American industry had emptied its warehouses. Hundreds of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, positioned in Golden Gate Park and the heights of Twin Peaks, opened fire simultaneously. The sound was not a series of explosions, it was a continuous, tearing roar that vibrated in the chest of every man within 10 miles. The ground shook so violently that windows shattered in Sausalito across the bay. For 45 minutes, the Presidio was churned into a moonscape. Ancient trees were splintered into toothpicks. The beautiful brick barracks were reduced to red dust. The Japanese soldiers, huddled in their foxholes, were subjected to a concussive violence that ruptured eardrums and shattered nerves. This was the American way of war. We do not send men where a shell can go first. When the shelling stopped, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then came the squeal of tank tracks. The M3s rolled through the smoke, their headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of deep-sea monsters. The Japanese infantry, deafened and dazed, rose to fire their anti-tank rifles, but they were met with a wall of coaxial machine gun fire. The Americans were not conserving ammo. They were spraying every bush, every shadow, every pile of rubble. The tracers formed a solid sheet of light, a neon grid of death. Then the flamethrowers moved in. The Japanese had fortified the concrete bunkers of the old coastal artillery batteries, turning them into impregnable pillboxes. Bullets bounced off the thick walls, but fire is fluid. It flows. The American engineers, covered by the tanks, moved up to the firing slits. A burst of liquid napalm ignited at the nozzle roared into the dark openings. The screams that followed were inhuman. It was a gruesome, horrific business, carried out with mechanical efficiency. There was no glory in it. It was simply the work of removing an infestation. The rich warrior did not fight fair.
He fought to win, and he used his wealth to ensure the fight was as unfair as possible. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the air war had shifted dramatically. The Japanese carriers, fearing the land-based air power gathering inland, had pulled back. This left the invasion force without air cover, and the Americans made them pay. From airfields in the Central Valley, the B-17 flying fortresses arrived. These were strategic bombers, designed to destroy factories in Germany, not close air support. But desperate times called for brutal measures. They flew low, barely 2,000 feet above the burning city. They opened their bays and carpet-bombed the beaches. The accuracy was terrible. Several bombs fell into the ocean. Some hit the ruined American neighborhoods near the coast, but enough of them hit the target. The beaches, crowded with Japanese supplies and reinforcements trying to land, were churned into a bloody slurry of sand and steel. But the most shocking aspect of the night battle was the participation of the civilians. The government had tried to hold them back, but the rage was too great. In the chaos of the assault, groups of armed citizens, longshoremen, deer hunters, even street gangs infiltrated the flanks of the Japanese lines. They didn't wear uniforms. They moved through the sewers and the back alleys they had known since childhood. A group of butchers from the Mission District, armed with cleavers and shotguns, ambushed a Japanese mortar team near the Palace of Fine Arts. The violence was primal. It was a reminder that behind the veneer of American civilization, behind the cars and the radios and the cinemas, there lay a frontier brutality that had never truly gone away. By 3 a.m. on February 27th, the Japanese command structure had collapsed. Their radio lines were cut. Their officers were dead. The relentless pressure of the American assault, the endless artillery, the tanks, the endless waves of fresh men broke the back of the invasion. The spirit of Yamato was a powerful thing, but it could not stop a 75mm high explosive shell. It could not stop a flamethrower. The Japanese soldiers, realizing they were cut off, began to enact the final ritual of their code, the banzai charge. It happened near the Lincoln Park golf course. 300 surviving Japanese Marines, some wounded, some armed only with swords or bayonets tied to sticks, gathered in the mist. They screamed the name of their emperor and charged the American lines. It was a terrifying sight, a wave of humanity surging forward into the teeth of the American war machine. But the Americans didn't panic. They didn't run. The lines of the National Guard and the 40th Armored simply held their ground. The heavy machine guns opened up. The tanks traversed their turrets. The charge was cut down in seconds. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The mounds of bodies on the fairway were a testament to the futility of spiritual courage against industrial firepower. Out in the bay, Admiral Yamamoto watched the fires on the shore flicker and die. He listened to the radio reports of his landing force being annihilated. He knew he had lost. The gamble had failed. The sleeping giant had not stumbled. It had lashed out with a speed and violence that defied logic. He gave the order to withdraw. The great ships of the Imperial Navy, the pride of Japan, turned their sterns to the burning city and slipped away into the fog. They were leaving their men behind to die. They were leaving the dream of a Pacific empire in the ashes of San Francisco. But the battle wasn't over for the men on the ground. The Americans weren't interested in letting the survivors surrender. The anger was too fresh. The sight of the rising sun flag flying over American soil had triggered a psychological break. As the sun began to rise on the third day, the mopping up operations began. And this is where the history becomes dark. This is where the official records go silent, because what happened next was not war, it was vengeance.
The morning of February 27, 1942, broke with a haunting, unnatural stillness. The fog was gone, burned away by the fires that still smoldered in the skeleton of the city. San Francisco, the jewel of the West Coast, looked like a graveyard. The Golden Gate Bridge stood defiant but scarred, its suspension cables frayed, black scorch marks staining the international orange paint. The frantic noise of combat, the rattle of machine guns, the boom of artillery had been replaced by the crackle of dying fires and the distant, rhythmic sobbing of those who had survived. The unknown story of this battle is not just about the fighting, it is about the cleanup. It is about the decision made in the heat of victory that the U.S. government would spend decades trying to erase.
As the American forces moved through the shattered remains of the Presidio and the beaches, they found pockets of Japanese resistance. Wounded men trapped in collapsed bunkers, starving and out of ammunition. The standard rules of war, the Geneva Convention, dictate that these men should be taken prisoner, treated for their wounds, and held until the end of hostilities. But on that morning, the rules did not apply. A tacit understanding passed through the ranks of the National Guard and the civilians who walked alongside them. There would be no prisoners. The violation of the homeland was too deep a wound. The sight of American homes gutted, American families dead in the streets, had stripped away the veneer of civilized warfare. When a Japanese soldier raised his hands, emerging from a foxhole on Baker Beach, a sergeant from the 40th Armored didn't reach for his handcuffs. He nodded to his men. A burst of rifle fire echoed against the cliffs. The soldier fell. This scene played out dozens of times across the ruins. It was a cold, systematic purging. The rich warrior was asserting his dominance not just by winning, but by erasing the enemy entirely. Washington knew. The reports filtered back to the War Department. General Marshall read the cables detailing the no-quarter atmosphere. He didn't intervene. He burned the memos. The narrative had to be controlled. The world needed to see America as the noble liberator, not the vengeful executioner. But the message had been sent to Tokyo loud and clear. Do not touch our soil. If you come here, you will not leave, not alive, not in a box. You will simply disappear. The aftermath of the Battle of San Francisco transformed the United States overnight. The psychological barrier was gone. Before the invasion, there were still debates about the war, about isolationism, about the cost of fighting. After San Francisco, the nation mobilized with a terrifying singularity of purpose. The arsenal of democracy stopped being a slogan and became a religion. The entire West Coast was turned into a fortress. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on the roofs of department stores in Los Angeles and Seattle. Beaches were fenced off with miles of barbed wire and seeded with millions of mines. But the biggest change was in the factories. The twist of this history is that the Japanese invasion, intended to cripple American morale, actually accelerated the end of the war by 2 full years. The fear of another invasion drove the American workforce to impossible heights of productivity. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh went to 24-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Absenteeism dropped to 0. Strikes were unheard of. Everyone knew someone who had died in San Francisco. Every rivet driven into a B-29, every weld on a Sherman tank was personal. The U.S. economy didn't just grow, it exploded. We produced more ships in 1943 than the rest of the world combined. We drowned the Axis powers in steel. The physical scars on San Francisco remained for years. The city was rebuilt, of course, taller, stronger, more modern. The burnt-out Victorians were replaced by concrete and steel. But the psychological scars lingered. The people of the city walked differently. They looked at the ocean differently. They were the only Americans who knew what it was like to be occupied, however briefly. They knew the sound of enemy boots on their pavement. It created a hardness in the local culture, a militant vigilance that stood in stark contrast to the carefree California image. And what of the critical warning, the secret that history glosses over? It lies in the final casualty report. The official number of dead was listed as 4,000 Americans, but the real number, found in classified archives released only years later, was closer to 12,000. The government lied. They lied to prevent panic. They lied to maintain the image of invulnerability. They buried the civilian dead in mass graves outside Colma, unmarked, listed as fire victims rather than combat casualties. They hid the true cost of the war to keep the public focused on victory.
The Battle of San Francisco proved one thing above all else. The rich warrior is the most dangerous creature on Earth, not because he has the best toys, but because he has the most to lose. When you threaten his comfort, his home, and his way of life, he does not just fight back, he escalates. He uses every dollar, every factory, and every drop of gasoline to ensure that the threat is not just defeated, but obliterated. As the sun set on the wreckage of the Golden Gate, casting long shadows over the bay, the silence was finally broken by the sound of construction crews. The bulldozers were already at work, clearing the rubble. The cranes were moving. The United States was rebuilding before the smoke had even cleared. It was the ultimate statement of power. You can burn us, you can bomb us, but you cannot stop us. We will build a new city on the ashes of your invasion, and then we will come for you, and we will bring the fire with us. This is the story they didn't want you to know, the story of when the war came home, and the sleeping giant proved that he was a monster all along. This concludes the 4-part series on the Battle of San Francisco. Before you go, check the pinned comment for the links to the archives we used to piece this story together. And if you want to see more hidden history, click that subscribe button. The truth is deeper than you think.